What's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here, Athletics. Today we're going to be talking about should you imitate MLB pitchers' mechanics. This idea originally came from a Twitter thread that I did where I basically pointed out, like, hey, if you played baseball 10, 15 years ago, you probably tried to throw like Tim Lincecum at some point. And for the vast majority of you, you didn't actually end up moving like him on the mound. You didn't look like him on the mound. You didn't get the outcome that you were hoping for. But the question is, why is that? And so that's kind of an interesting question that I wanted to dig a little bit deeper in today, and then I dug a little bit deeper into on that thread as well. So we're also going to talk about, in general, should we be even attempting to imitate MLB pitchers in general, or even using them as player comps from a coaching perspective. And then finally, we'll also get into, if so, what actually makes a good comp? How, as coaches or even as athletes, can we decide, hey, which pitcher should we be trying to emulate, or should we even be trying to emulate them at all? So without further ado, let's get into that topic. So Tim Lincecum was certainly fun to watch as an example for this idea. And he found what worked for him. Like, it's pretty undeniable that he was getting everything he possibly could out of his body. He was throwing upwards of 100 miles an hour at, I believe he was listed at 170 pounds, 5'10". So he was certainly performing what for him was efficient mechanics. He had a huge drift and coil, way more than is kind of typical. He had a ton of sit into his back hip. So we got really deep into the hinge, into that hip abduction position, getting into some pretty extreme positions. He strode around 100% or even more of his height in terms of his stride length. He got exceptional extension as well. He also came from an extremely high arm slot, which required him to get a ton of hip and thoracic extension in his landing position. He also generated very elite hip-shoulder separation as well. So he was moving extremely differently down the mound and getting into much crazier positions than most any other pitcher that you were watching on TV at the time. But the real question is, why can't anyone just replicate these patterns? Why couldn't other MLB pitchers get into the same positions? Or what was necessarily special about Tim? Besides just calling him the freak, let's dig a little bit deeper. What made him special from that standpoint? And what can we learn about this situation from the Tim example specifically? So let's real quick just discuss how movement patterns actually emerge. It's important to realize that our mechanics, specifically in this context, are emerging as a result of various constraints. So what I mean by constraints, you can think of the three main ones here are environment, organism, and task. So let's use long toss as an example to kind of break down how our mechanics emerge. So environment, right? Our mechanics are going to look and act and feel different if the environment changes. So for example, we have Tim here, looks like he's just kind of warming up for a game. He's working out in long toss. Would his mechanics look the same if he had cleats on as he does here versus turfs versus throwing in socks? Right, that's an example of changing a variable there. Let's say the weather, right? If it's 20 degrees outside versus 100 degrees outside. Let's say the wind. Let's say if he's throwing on a baseball field versus maybe he's on a football field and he's throwing right along the line of the football field, right? There's going to be different factors in the environment that are going to influence how your mechanics and how your movement actually emerges. Task. So the task could be as simple as trying to throw as far as possible in a long toss example. It could also be, hey, maybe the task here is to stay as loose as possible, working your way out. It's not to throw as hard as you can. Maybe the task is try to throw it on a line. Maybe the task is try to throw it with arc. Maybe the task is try to hit your partner in the chest, try to be as accurate as possible with each throw, or try to create a certain amount of spin or certain spin axis, right? The task is going to dictate how your body actually moves and organizes itself to achieve that specific goal. And then finally, the organism constraints. So the actual internal constraints, the structural constraints, the physiological constraints, how your body actually moves and is wired, is structured, is going to also impact how your body has the potential to move. So if you're fatigued versus fresh, your body's going to move differently. If you have some tightness or tone issue, you've got tight hips or tight upper back, tight throwing shoulder, right? That's going to influence how your arm moves, how your body moves. Strength issues, joint health, right? We know Tim was a guy who kind of ran into some hip problems the later part of his career, and you can pretty noticeably tell how his mechanics changed at that point, got a little bit less dynamic, a little bit less explosive into his back leg. CNS arousal, how amped up you are at 8 a.m. game. 8 a.m. bullpen is going to be different than a 8 p.m. game in a clutch situation in front of 50,000 people. So anyway, just a kind of big picture example of environment, task, organism. There's all sorts of constraints around us all the time, and it's going to influence how we actually elicit movement. So just kind of big picture, wanted to cover that first before we break down why it's so difficult to just emulate Tim in that example. So here's just some really obvious kind of organism constraints, so to speak, some differences in terms of your likely structure and physiology compared to Tim's, which would have strongly limited your ability to actually perform the same mechanics that he was able to perform. So right here, this picture, you can just see the crazy positions he was able to get into. So, things like limb lengths and ratios, the ratio of your torso to your lower half to, your humerus to your forearm, all these ratios, your flexibility, your ability to actually relax into positions, active and passive range of motion, tissue quality, joint health, stability, injury history, total body strength, power, like all these different variables would be considered organismic constraints. And so we just go down the list, like, do you have the ability to relax into positions like Tim? Probably not. Do you have the same active or passive range of motion, tissue quality that Tim had at his peak? Probably not. Joint health, stability, right? Does Tim get into some of the same positions later on in his career with hip issues? Not exactly. Total body strength, power. What happens to Tim's mechanics if you took 10, 15 pounds of muscle off him, made him even weaker, doesn't have the same stability? Like, is he able to get into the same positions, move down the mountain the same way? Probably not. So all these different variables actually influence our mechanics and start to help you see and kind of peel back layers of the onion to understand why it's not as simple as just trying to throw like a given pitcher if your body doesn't actually have the capabilities, the raw materials to even have a shot at producing that type of movement. So how did Tim's patterns themselves emerge? We can speculate a little bit based on this framework, but it's pretty safe to say that Tim's mechanics didn't emerge at 18 years old when he watched Cy Young Tim Lincecum throw on TV and decided he wanted to just try to throw like Tim Lincecum. Right, his mechanics emerged in a much more organic fashion as a result of, again, environment, task, and organismic constraints over the course of his youth and high school, and as he developed into those patterns, versus just at a moment's notice seeing somebody throw on TV and trying to throw like that guy. So how does that actually happen? Well, we can speculate a little bit, but we know that he learned a lot of the kind of theory of his mechanics from his dad. He, in many ways, learned this sequence of patterns from what his dad was able to teach. So you actually look at how his dad throws on video, and it's actually very, very similar. So he was definitely able to kind of be in this rich environment for learning from what his dad was able to do. He was able to imitate some of the same positions and patterns because likely he was playing catch with his dad. He was seeing examples from his dad, and he had a lot of the same communication of like the feels associated with what his dad was able to communicate with him. So he was already getting that piece of it. From a task standpoint, we know that he was big into long toss in high school and college. What is long toss really good at? Kind of reinforcing and encouraging. It's really good at reinforcing a kind of higher arm slots, high carry, high axis, forcing fastballs. So a throw is kind of successful if you throw it as far as you can and the ball travels further. That's a successful throw in long toss. So he was basically training in such a way that you would expect him to develop a little bit of a higher slot, a little bit more thoracic extension, a little bit more trunk, a little bit more contralateral tilt at ball release. And so perhaps all the long toss he was doing is part of the reason that he didn't end up a low three-quarter guy. He ended up being more of a high three-quarter over the top guy. Picking up the dollar, we know he was given various cues and kind of task constraints by his dad in his training. Picking up the dollar, possibly could contribute to the extension, kind of leaping down the mound aspect that he had, because he was trying to get as far out as he could, trying to get that extreme extension in order to be able to accomplish that task of picking up the dollar that he worked on with his dad. So you can just see how some of how he was training and the environment that he grew up in could clearly have been a major influence in terms of how these patterns actually developed. Whereas you and I didn't grow up with Tim Lincecum's father and necessarily, trying to pick up the dollar off the mound. He did. Organismic constraints, we've already kind of touched on this, but one thing to discuss is he had likely very comparable kind of organismic constraints to his father. They share the same genetics, and so they likely had very similar hip-shoulder separation capabilities, thoracic spine mobility, shoulder laxity, like a lot of these subtle variables that might be different between you, me, and Tim Lincecum, like they share a lot of those similarities. So if Tim's father said, let's try to get into this position, because he could, well, Tim probably had the ability to do it within his actual body because he shared a lot of the same genetics. So for me, this is just kind of one possibility for why it's a much higher likelihood that the son of a MLB pitcher will end up being successful because they're growing up in such a rich learning environment from a motor skill standpoint, from the environment, the task, but then specifically the organism. Like, they're sharing the genetics with their father, who is likely who they're imitating their patterns from, but they're actually able to do that because they have a lot of the same mobility and a lot of the same organism constraints they're dealing with. To me, that's just kind of an interesting aside as to why you so often see the son of MLB pitcher be able to accomplish similar positions as their father. So case in point, you likely didn't have the capacity to throw like Tim ever. Like, this was probably a doomed experiment from the start if you were trying to perfectly look like Tim Lincecum. But that's okay, right? Aroldis Chapman, if you try to throw like Tim Lincecum, he likely wouldn't look like Tim Lincecum either. That doesn't mean that he hasn't found what is most efficient for his body. So what's optimal for your body is almost certainly not what is or was optimal for Tim Lincecum. So the real goal is trying to figure out what is optimal for our body, and that's what coaching, that's what development is all about. So one thing that I didn't note about this as well is that it's not just about the physiology and these kind of organism constraints as far as having the mobility, having the strength, like hitting certain numbers in the weight room, having a certain degrees of thoracic spine rotation. Like, you can kind of see these as the raw materials, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you will move that way in kind of a dynamic context and be able to produce that same level of fluidity, power, rhythm, etc. So you still need the athleticism and skill to perform it efficiently. Right, I was a guy who in high school, had great mobility. I was strong, athletic, but I just didn't understand how to tie everything together and throw efficiently and sequence everything efficiently. And so that's why I threw 73, but was able to throw 95 several years later. Is because I was able to tie it all together with the actual skill component. So you can think of this as the difference between like an expert dancer or beginner in a certain dance move, right? If you took a beginner, you taught him some kind of complex dance move and you walked him through it in slow motion, he might be able to get into the positions. And if you took a photograph of him doing this move, you might think, oh, it's the same as the other guy. He gets into the same positions. But the expert is able to actually stitch those positions together with fluidity, rhythm, power. And so that's really the difference. It's not as simple as just being able to get into a position. You need the ability to actually smooth it together and execute that skill. So Tim spent years actually finally honing this motor skill. He didn't just try to pick it up in a week by imitating somebody else. Athleticism, so body control, awareness, coordination, these are big components of athleticism. I think these are kind of core tenets of athleticism. Is really an underrated component to developing high-level patterns or motor skills. And just anecdotally, this seems to be a big differentiator with our MLB guys versus even our minor league guys and our college guys, is they all seem to have very, very good body control, awareness, and they're able to pick up kind of new movements very, very quickly. They're very in tune with their bodies. They have good strength, they have good power, they get into pretty decent positions, but like that's something that almost universally is the case with these MLB guys, is that body awareness, control, and just being really in tune with what their body's able to do. To touch on this component of athleticism a little bit more, to me it's no surprise that the most athletic, efficient pitchers or deliveries, think of anybody off the top of your head, they typically come from the most athletic pitchers. Right? This seems super obvious, but these are the guys where you'll hear stories of their athleticism or their athletic feats off the field. So they're not just able to demonstrate that athleticism in the specific context of the mound, but Tim, in his case, he was known for doing backflips, walking around on his hands, being able to pick up things really quickly, being good at anything he tried. Golf, darts, it didn't really matter. You hear similar stories about Jacob deGrom, Aroldis Chapman. Tim Collins, to me, is one of the most athletic deliveries from a 5'7" guy throwing 97. He was also a guy with outrageous power, outrageous athleticism. So it's just interesting to me that this is really the same story with a lot of these athletic MLB pitchers. As far as developing athleticism, it's helpful to play a lot of sports at a young age. That's really the critical time where you're not going to be getting super strong at a young age. You don't have the hormonal profile to build a ton of muscle, but at those young ages, that's when you can be acquiring all these different motor capabilities and developing this athletic base. Body control, awareness, coordination. I've had some conversations with a variety of MLB pitchers who trained martial arts or trained karate when they were younger. And I actually feel like this could be the perfect sport at a young age to be learning some of these things. What is karate? It's basically learning body control, awareness, coordination, and being able to sequence the kinetic chain, whether it's a kick, whether it's a punch, whether it's any sort of athletic movement. Like, that is what karate is. So as far as building this athletic base, that could be one option, but just playing a lot of sports, to me, this makes it significantly easier to pick up other skills later on once you've developed this athletic base. So to me, that's really the value of athleticism, is developing this base, and you can have the higher likelihood of being able to acquire these athletic deliveries once you've acquired this kind of general athletic base. So is imitating MLB pitchers actually a good idea? Because I've just given you a lot of reasons as to why it might not be a good idea. You don't throw like Tim Lincecum, you don't have the same structure as him or a lot of other pitchers. So is it ever a good idea? While we know that imitating random deliveries every other week is probably not going to yield positive results, to me there's still a lot of value in studying the best throwers, especially from a coaching standpoint, because it gives you the ability to appreciate a wide range of different body types and what might be the most efficient set of movement patterns for them. For example, Edwin Diaz, right? He's got extreme hip internal rotation. You can just see it from the positions he's able to get into. He'd be a terrible guy to imitate for a guy who doesn't have hips like that, doesn't have the same type of structure as that. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't give a coach or doesn't give a player an appreciation for how different types of bodies can actually move in an efficient way. So once you have kind of this profile in your head of these hundreds, thousands of different pitchers that can all move efficiently, all throw 95 plus in your head, now you start to become able to actually use comps, be able to use player comps from a coaching application standpoint, which we'll talk about next. So let's talk about using player comps. It's obviously used in scouting, which makes a ton of sense, but what about player development? So player comps can help highlight deficient areas in a player's delivery and help them see or understand the missing piece in a much more concrete and visual way than you just trying to explain it in more of an abstract way. So it's important to realize that this must be an appropriate comp. So, right, if you have a 5'7" pitcher, you probably shouldn't give them Randy Johnson as a mechanical comp because they're just dealing with completely different structures, body types, timing, etc., arm slots. So if we can choose a comp to communicate something to a player, like let's say they have a stabbing arm action and we want them to kind of smooth out that arm path, but everything else we're pretty okay with, it's pretty efficient. We'd probably want to pick a pitcher who has similar height, similar lever length, similar timing, similar arm slot, similar hip structure, similar lower half. If we can find a pitcher that kind of fits those criteria, but ideally one that, while fitting most of those criteria, does the one thing that we're trying to work on better. Like maybe he has everything else the same, but he doesn't have a stabbing arm path. He has a more fluid arm path. To me, that would be the ideal comp in a situation because it helps the athlete see his mechanics and see the example of what his mechanics might look like if you change just that one variable. So maybe you choose Marcus Stroman for this guy. Maybe he throws like Marcus Stroman, but he just has a stabbing arm action. And so maybe Stroman becomes the perfect comp for that guy to visually see and understand what pattern you're trying to get him to achieve. To me, it's also important to kind of avoid using pitchers as comps that have just massive like stylistic outliers. Tim Lincecum is an example of that, where probably not the best comp to use for most scenarios, not that it can't work. So to me, it's way more of an art than a science when it comes to comps, but I think that's okay. And I think from a development standpoint, you have to be comfortable kind of going back and forth between the art and the science aspect of development. So just because you tried to throw like Tim Lincecum back in high school and it didn't necessarily work, doesn't mean that with the right comp, with the right context, picking a very similar pitcher or a very specific piece of their delivery and trying to emulate that can't yield positive results in a specific direction, specific to your body and mechanics. So we call this intelligent trial and error. Basically, tinkering can work in the right context from this lens. So basically just trialing bits and pieces of different efficient throwers' mechanics. Now, this is not something that you would just randomly do in season. This is probably more of an off-season thing. You typically should have a good rationale for doing so, whether it's from a player standpoint or from a coaching standpoint. So not just randomly going out there and trying to throw like a different pitcher every week for the sake of it, but specifically picking somebody you think is a good comp, and we're going to try and test this one part of their delivery and just see what the impact is, good or bad. So we can be as objective as possible about the pros and cons. So for example, we have a pitcher who maybe they throw similar to Jacob deGrom, but you notice that deGrom added a glove tap in 2020 and it seemed to help. So maybe we're going to play with adding a glove tap. We're going to play with that in the off season. We want to measure if that actually works or doesn't work. So maybe we objectively split test that in a bullpen, get 5 to 10 one way, 5 to 10 the other way. We also get the subjective. We ask them the comfort level. How did it feel? We see if they're still able to throw strikes that way. How does it feel in your arm? How does it affect the pitch metrics? Can we be as objective as possible and get as much data as possible on if this change is actually working? From that standpoint, if it doesn't work, you just scrap it, move on. If it does work, maybe that's something we begin to incorporate into this pitcher's actual mechanics. So a random shot in the dark approach is unlikely to help and may hurt performance in the wrong context, like I said, in season, or without actually gathering information if it's helping or hurting. It might be hurting, and you should probably abandon that change. You'll know if you're actually gathering information. So examples, my example from this is, I've written an article about this, but I learned the drift from initially kind of observing Tim Lincecum and trying to emulate his first move. Just going into a bullpen and playing with that first move and saying, we'll just see what happens, and seeing that I was throwing 3 miles an hour harder immediately by trying to do that. Like, that's an example of intelligent tinkering. Roger Clemens, we've seen this work using his first move. So his a little coil and dip with his first move, dipping the front shoulder. We've played with that in the right context, and that's helped certain guys. Certain guys it hasn't worked, and we've dropped it. The glove tap DeGrom example, you come up with a million other examples of this as well. So ultimately, there's no real such thing as perfect textbook mechanics. So if you're trying to apply a blanket philosophy of everyone needs to have a vertical shin, everyone needs to stay into their heel, everyone needs to stay tall, stay back, whatever your specific image in your head is of perfect mechanics, if you try to apply that to everybody, that's going to work for some guys and that's not going to work for other guys. What we need to be able to do is recognize that while there isn't such thing as perfect mechanics, there is such thing as what's most efficient for you or for a specific player. And what the answer to that is, what that equation is for each individual player, is going to largely be based upon what their body can and can't do. This is something that my buddy Greg Rose talks about all the time with TPI, with on-base U. So it really helps to understand an athlete's structure and limitations from a movement screen standpoint, but also how is that going to influence what we do from a training standpoint, and then also how they actually move on the mound. It's going to have a huge impact, right? Your hip rotation capability is going to change. The patterns you're going to be able to move through on the mound, how we produce power, all these things begin to interrelate, like we already discussed. And then finally, a good comp can provide very helpful athlete feedback without the need for internal cues. So to me, I'm always trying to come up with how do we influence movement in a way that doesn't yip the athlete up, doesn't dome them up, doesn't get them super analytical about what's going on. Or instead of getting in their head about like the stabbing arm action and really thinking about their arm path, like what if I can just manipulate an environment, manipulate the task, or show him a video of a very good mechanical comp and give him that internal kind of visual of what they're trying to achieve and not even have to say anything at all. To me, that's the gold standard if we can figure out ways to do that. So we'll use comps in that way as well. Hopefully you guys got something out of this video. Go ahead, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already, and let me know down below what you thought and if you have any suggestions for future content. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks again.